It started like any other quiet morning, until the police drew their guns on a janitor outside a library. But within 7 minutes, FBI agents stormed the station. Who was this man? Why did the government respond so fast? What you're about to hear is not just a story, it's a revelation. One that reminds us how easily we misjudge, and how deeply some people hide in plain sight. The morning sun was just beginning to stretch its light across the empty parking lot of the Pine Hollow Public Library. A soft breeze rustled the trees, and the distant chirp of birds made it feel like any other quiet day in the small town. Jack Morgan, 69 years old and moving with the practiced calm of a man long accustomed to silence, knelt beside his old pickup truck to retie the fraying laces of his boots. His canvas bag, worn, stained, dependable, hung from one shoulder, weighed down with tools, duct tape, and a thermos of lukewarm coffee. Clipped to his belt was a utility knife, standard for someone who had spent the last decade fixing broken shelves and leaky faucets in the library. He had just stood up and brushed the dust off his pants when he heard the squeal of tires, too sharp, too fast. A police cruiser swerved in beside him, jarring the peace. "Hands where I can see them." Officer Drew Bell, young, brash, and loud, was already out of the vehicle with his weapon drawn. His partner, Officer Carter, exited more slowly, one hand hovering near his holster, eyes scanning, unsure. Jack didn't move right away, not from defiance, but from disbelief. He blinked once, squinting at the bright morning light, and slowly raised his hands. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice low but not confrontational. It was the kind of voice you hear from someone who's lived through too many things to be rattled by adrenaline. Bell's eyes narrowed. "We got a call. Suspicious man, hiding behind the dumpsters. You match the description. You carrying anything?" Jack exhaled through his nose, steady. "My ID. And a sidearm. Registered. In my coat pocket." At the word sidearm, Bell's stance changed. He moved in fast, aggressive. He pulled the weapon from Jack's coat like he'd just disarmed a bomb, as if the calm old man might suddenly explode into violence. Jack didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He just stared at the ground, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, feeling the cold bite of steel on his wrists and the burn of old bones protesting the strain. Across the street, a few people had stopped to watch. One of them lifted a phone to start recording. Jack didn't look up. He didn't plead. But something in him, something buried deep under years of silence, shifted. They thought they'd caught a drifter. A strange old man with a weapon and no badge. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know, was that in arresting him, they had just triggered something far bigger than a routine stop. The world was about to remember who Jack Morgan really was. Inside the Pine Hollow Police Department, the air was thick with an uneasy quiet, the kind that hums beneath fluorescent lights and lingers in the spaces between unanswered questions. The station was small, outdated, a mix of faded wanted posters, blinking terminals, and the faint smell of burnt coffee from a pot that had been sitting too long. And at the center of that silence sat Jack Morgan. He was still in the holding cell, hands cuffed behind him, shoulders slightly hunched, not from fear, but from a slow, enduring fatigue that lived in his bones. His hoodie was damp from the morning dew, clinging to his back like a second skin. The fabric at the cuffs was worn, fraying. His eyes, sharp but tired, didn't wander. He didn't scan the room or glare through the one-way glass. He just stared straight ahead, like a man who had learned long ago that stillness was a weapon, and silence its trigger. Outside the cell, Officer Carter tapped at his keyboard, frowning. His brows were drawn tight as he flipped through pages of the database. Officer Bell, by contrast, was pacing like a man who believed he'd done something right but was waiting for the applause. Dude says he's a janitor, Bell said, tossing a stapler from hand to hand like a toy. But he's strapped like it's Baghdad in '03. The joke hung awkwardly in the air. Carter didn't laugh. He didn't even look up. No priors, Carter muttered. Nothing recent. But... His voice trailed off. Something on the screen flashed red. A warning box had appeared, no beep, no sound, just bold blinking text pulsing like a slow heartbeat. Active asset. Do not process. Priority intercept. Carter blinked. Then a second line. Then a third. The same message duplicating across the screen like a glitch, except it wasn't a glitch. It was deliberate. Urgent. Measured. Then came the final line, chilling in its authority. Federal override initiated. Stand by for contact. The silence broke like glass. The station phone rang with a sudden, shrill tone. It was too loud for a quiet place like this, too sharp. Officer Maria Knoll reached for it, almost hesitating. Her fingers were trembling slightly. Pine Hollow PD, she said automatically, then fell silent. As she listened, her face went pale. She turned to the others, eyes wide. They said to stop everything. Don't process him. Don't speak to him. Federal agents are on their way, ETA 7 minutes. Bell's confident swagger faltered. He exchanged a glance with Carter. Wait, what? Who the hell is this guy? Carter didn't answer. He just stared through the glass at Jack, who hadn't moved an inch. Not a blink. Not a breath out of rhythm. His posture hadn't shifted. But his presence, was heavy now. Like he'd grown taller without standing up. Like the room was bending around him, gravity responding to something unspoken. He's not bluffing, Carter whispered. He knew. He's been waiting. Outside, the deep hum of approaching engines rolled in like thunder before a storm. 3 black SUVs glided silently into the parking lot, unmarked, matte, deliberate. Their doors opened with quiet clicks, not a slam among them. 4 agents emerged. They didn't run. They didn't shout. They didn't need to. Every step was calm. Controlled. Commanding. And at the head of them walked Agent Vance, gray at the temples, silver tie, a face carved from patience and war. His eyes scanned the station like they'd already memorized its layout. He didn't pause. He didn't look confused. He was here for something. For someone. He approached the front desk, his voice low but lethal in its clarity. Who arrested Jack Morgan? The room froze. Bell slowly raised his hand like a guilty schoolboy. We did. Officers Bell and Carter. He matched a suspicious person report. And, he was armed. You ran his ID? Vance asked, his gaze unmoving. Yes, sir, Carter said. That's when the alert. Vance held up a hand. Not to stop him, just to indicate that the mistake had already been made. That, Vance said, eyes narrowing slightly, was your mistake. Then he walked past them, toward the holding cell, toward the man they'd cuffed like a common criminal. And inside that cell, Jack Morgan finally moved. He looked up, slow and deliberate. Not surprised. Not afraid. Just, ready. The air inside the holding cell was suffocatingly still. It was the kind of silence that hung heavy in the room, the kind that clung to your skin, like the very walls were holding their breath. Jack Morgan sat in the corner, the faint buzzing of the overhead lights almost too loud in the quiet. His hands were resting loosely on his knees, but the way his shoulders were hunched, the tension coiling in his frame, made it clear he wasn't entirely relaxed. His mind was in constant motion, running through scenarios, calculating risks. But on the outside, he looked like nothing more than a man waiting in a holding cell. His eyes didn't shift as he heard the soft, almost imperceptible click of the lock. The door creaked open just enough for Agent Vance to step in. The air in the room shifted immediately, a sense of urgency trailing Vance like a shadow. The agent didn't step lightly, didn't try to hide the force with which he entered. His movements were purposeful, and even though the room was small, there was something about his presence that made the space feel even tighter. Jack didn't look up. He didn't need to. He had known this moment was coming for a long time. But still, as the agent moved closer, Jack's gaze flickered, just for a moment, to the agent's shoes, polished, precise. He recognized the detail in the man's movements, the professionalism. Vance wasn't just any agent. He was someone who had been trained to break down a situation, to pick apart lies and motives in the blink of an eye. And Jack knew that. Vance stopped a few feet away, his eyes scanning Jack, as though trying to measure him, assess the man who had managed to disappear for over a decade. His voice, when it came, was cold, but there was an edge to it, something sharper than the usual calm he carried. "Jack Morgan," Vance said, his voice low, almost calculated. "I'm Agent Vance." Jack didn't flinch. His lips curled into a brief, tight smile, the kind that had become second nature. It was not a friendly smile, but one of recognition, of acknowledgement. He had been expecting this moment. And yet, even after all these years of hiding, of running, he couldn't deny the knot that twisted in his stomach. "I know who you are," Jack replied, his tone almost bored, as though they were discussing the weather. His eyes never left Vance's, steady and unwavering. "I've been waiting for you." There was a flicker of something in Vance's eyes. Surprise? Suspicion? Maybe both. Jack's response had thrown him off balance, just for a moment. He had expected a fight, a denial, maybe even a lie. But Jack's calm was something else entirely. It was like he was already past this point, like this was nothing more than a formality. Vance took a step forward, closing the distance between them, though he didn't sit. His eyes narrowed as he studied Jack more closely. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. "So you knew this was coming," Vance said, his voice now tinged with something like curiosity. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a question, but it hung in the air as if he was still trying to piece everything together. Jack shifted slightly, his body language still restrained but now subtly tense. His fingers twitched, a faint sign of impatience, but it passed almost immediately. "Long enough to know it was inevitable," Jack said, his voice flat but firm. His gaze remained locked on Vance, not with hostility, but with a quiet certainty. "You don't get to stay off the radar forever. Someone always finds you." Vance's jaw tightened as he processed the words. There was something unnerving about Jack's calmness. It was like a man who had been through so much that nothing rattled him anymore, like the stakes didn't matter because he had already paid his price long ago. Vance opened his mouth to speak again, but Jack beat him to it. "You're not the first to come looking," Jack said, his voice softer now, almost detached. He leaned back against the cold concrete wall, as though settling in for a conversation rather than an interrogation. "And you won't be the last." The agent's eyes flickered with an unreadable emotion, his gaze never wavering from Jack. The tension was palpable now, but it was different. It wasn't the standoff between a cop and a criminal. It was the standoff between two men who had lived lives that no one else could understand. Vance exhaled sharply, his fingers tapping the folder in his hand. "You've been off the grid for over 10 years, Vance said, his tone flat but with a note of finality. "And now, you're back. You've resurfaced. Why now? Jack didn't flinch. He didn't even blink. His eyes didn't break contact with Vance's as he replied. Because I've run long enough, Jack said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. Because it's time to finish what was started. The words hung in the air between them, thick with meaning. For the first time, Vance's composure slipped just slightly. He leaned forward, his voice softer but insistent. This isn't just about your past, Jack. This is bigger than you. You've been in hiding for a reason. Now people want answers. People want you dead. Jack's lips tightened into a thin line, his eyes narrowing slightly as he listened to Vance's words. There was no fear in him, no hesitation. Just an almost sad acceptance. They've always wanted me dead, Jack said quietly. But I'm still here. A silence stretched out between them, deep and heavy. Vance stood motionless, watching Jack with a mixture of confusion and respect. There was something about this man, something he couldn't quite place. Something that made him more dangerous than he'd first imagined. I'm pulling you out, Vance said after a long pause. You're too valuable to be left in the hands of amateurs. You're going to a safe house, off the grid. Jack stood slowly, his joints creaking as he stretched. There was no sign of fear, no hint of worry. He didn't rush. He didn't hurry. His movements were deliberate, each one measured. Let's go, Jack said. But know this, it won't be quiet. You can try to hide me, but they'll find me again. And when they do, his voice trailed off, his eyes meeting Vance's. When they do, they'll want me dead. Vance's face tightened as the weight of Jack's words settled over him. He knew Jack was right. The game had only just begun. The hum of the engine was the only sound that filled the SUV as it cut through the quiet streets. Jack sat in the back seat, his body tense, every muscle coiled in preparation for whatever came next. The world outside the window blurred as the vehicle picked up speed, his thoughts a turbulent storm that refused to calm. The city had become a cage, and the only escape now was the unknown, whatever it was Vance had in store for him. Jack's fingers drummed absent-mindedly on the armrest, the familiar rhythm serving as a small anchor in the chaos of his mind. He had been through countless operations, countless escape routes, but this felt different. The danger wasn't just external, it was within him. Every part of him wanted to ask questions, to push for answers, but he knew better. The world he had left behind was no place for questions. It was a world where you did what you were told, where following orders meant survival. As the SUV veered off the main road and into the winding, narrow paths that led deep into the mountains, Jack's eyes narrowed. He had been in places like this before, remote, desolate. But this time, the air felt colder, sharper, as if even the earth itself was holding its breath. The trees surrounding them were thick with age, their gnarled branches reaching out like the fingers of ghosts long forgotten. A strange sense of calm washed over Jack as he watched the darkened landscape pass by. He had always found peace in isolation. It was here, in the quiet of the wilderness, that he could think, could finally breathe without the weight of the world pressing on his chest. But the calm was fleeting. The vehicle slowed as it approached a small, dilapidated cabin nestled against the trees. Jack's eyes lingered on the structure for a moment, the sight of it triggering memories he had buried deep. This was the kind of place where secrets were kept, where people like him could vanish, forgotten by all but those who needed to remember. He stepped out of the SUV, his boots making a muted thud against the gravel driveway as the agents moved around him in practiced silence. The cabin was unassuming, almost invisible in the darkness, but to Jack, it was a symbol of everything he had become. A fugitive. A ghost. A man with a past so deeply entangled in shadows that even he couldn't see the light anymore. His throat tightened, but he swallowed the feeling down. He had learned long ago not to let emotion cloud his judgment, no matter how powerful the pull. Emotions only led to mistakes, and mistakes meant death. Vance led the way, his pace unwavering. Jack followed, his gaze flickering over the walls, the shadows that seemed to shift just out of the corner of his eye. The house felt alive, its very walls whispering to him, reminding him of the secrets it held. The door creaked as Vance opened it, a sound that seemed too loud for the quiet of the night. Inside, the cabin was sparse, functional, yet devoid of warmth. The only light came from a few flickering lamps casting long shadows on the wooden floors. "Welcome home," Vance's voice broke the silence, a statement that carried a weight of its own. Jack didn't respond. He didn't need to. The words were as hollow as the space they occupied. Vance motioned for Jack to sit at the worn table in the center of the room. A manila folder lay there, its edges creased from years of handling. Jack's eyes flickered to it, the contents already familiar to him. His entire life was in that file: missions, locations, allies, enemies, everything that had made him who he was and everything that had led him to this moment. He hadn't been out of the game for long, but being pulled back in like this felt different. There was a distinct feeling of finality in the air, a sense that this was no longer about survival. This was about retribution. Jack reached for the file, his fingers brushing against the paper. As he opened it, he saw the familiar names and dates, the mission reports that outlined every step he had taken in the field. His life, laid bare in black and white. The operations he had once carried out with precision and ruthless efficiency were now nothing more than a distant memory. Vance watched him silently, his expression unreadable. Jack didn't look up, his mind racing through the pages. He could almost hear the hum of the past in the back of his mind, the missions, the foreign lands, the people he had become over the years. But now, staring at the file, it felt like a lifetime ago. The man he was then seemed so far removed from the man sitting at this table. The weight of his past was like a chain around his neck, pulling him deeper into the abyss. There was no escape from it now. "Why am I here, Vance?" Jack's voice was low, almost tired. It wasn't the question of someone looking for information, it was the question of a man who had already seen too much, who had been dragged back into a world he thought he had left behind. Vance didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved across the room, his steps deliberate, as if considering his words carefully. Jack watched him, his eyes narrowing. He could feel the tension in the room, thick and suffocating, the air charged with something he couldn't quite identify. When Vance finally spoke, his voice was even, but the undertone of urgency was unmistakable. "There's a new target," Vance said. "Someone who's been tracking you." Jack's stomach tightened at the words, the reality of the situation crashing into him with the force of a freight train. He had known this was coming, the silence, the isolation, the sudden need for secrecy, it all pointed to one thing. Someone was coming after him. And they weren't just any enemy. "Who?" Jack's voice was barely a whisper, but the intensity in his gaze said everything. He wasn't afraid, but he was aware. The world had a way of catching up to people like him, and it always came at a price. Vance opened a new folder, sliding it across the table toward Jack. "We don't know much yet. But we know this, they're not the only ones hunting you." Jack picked up the file, his fingers curling around the edge of the paper. He could already feel the familiar rush of adrenaline flooding his veins, the pull of the hunt. He had survived so many close calls, so many close shaves with death that it had become second nature. But this was different. This wasn't just about survival. It was about revenge. He looked up at Vance, his expression cold and determined. Then let's get to work. Vance nodded, his eyes meeting Jack's with a quiet understanding. The game had changed. And Jack was ready to play. The air in the cabin seemed to grow heavier as the file slid across the table. Jack's fingers brushed the edge of the paper, his mind working quickly to absorb every bit of information in front of him. He wasn't looking for details, he already knew this game too well. What he was searching for was the one thing that could give him the edge, the one thing he could use to stay ahead of whoever was coming after him. Vance stood still, watching Jack with a quiet intensity, as if waiting for him to make the next move. For a moment, neither man spoke. The only sound in the room was the low creak of the floorboards beneath their feet, the crackling of a fire in the corner, and the occasional wind whistling through the narrow gaps in the cabin's wooden frame. Outside, the night had deepened, casting the world in a blanket of darkness. It was the perfect cover, but that meant nothing to Jack. Darkness was a friend to him, but it was also the cover of his enemies. Jack finally opened the folder, his eyes scanning the first page. The name that leapt out at him was one he hadn't expected to see, not after everything. He had assumed the targets of his past would stay buried, forgotten. But here it was, a name that brought back memories of old enemies and unfinished business. "This doesn't make sense," Jack muttered under his breath, his voice low but tinged with the disbelief he refused to let show on his face. "Why bring this up now? Why after all this time?" Vance took a step closer, his presence looming but still controlled. "The leak wasn't random. Someone knows about you, Jack. Someone who shouldn't. They're the ones pulling the strings now." Jack didn't need to hear more. He knew what that meant. It meant he had to move fast, faster than he had ever moved before. The years of silence, the years of living under a different name, were over. Someone had found him. And they wouldn't stop until they finished what they had started long ago. "What's the plan?" Jack's voice was sharp now, his focus returning as he closed the file. His hand gripped the edges tightly, the paper creaking in protest under his fingers. Vance didn't hesitate. "We need to find out who is behind this, and we need to do it quietly. No one can know you're back in play. Not yet, at least. The last thing we need is to draw attention." Jack nodded. He knew the risks, but that didn't stop the burning need to act. "Then what's our first move?" Vance's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Jack saw the flash of a man who had been in this game for far too long, someone who had seen more than his fair share of bloodshed and deception. "We have a contact in the city," Vance said. "He'll know who's been moving behind the scenes. But getting to him won't be easy. The people hunting you are good at staying hidden. They've covered their tracks well." Jack's mind was already working through the possibilities, weighing the risks. The city, the heart of everything he had left behind. The same city that had seen the last of him before he disappeared into the shadows. It was a city full of ghosts, full of people who owed him favors and people who wanted him dead. It wasn't home, but it was the only place that could give him the answers he needed. "We do this my way," Jack said, his tone unyielding. "We don't play by their rules. If they want to play dirty, then we show them how it's done." Vance didn't argue. He had learned long ago that Jack didn't follow orders, he made them. But Vance had also learned that Jack's methods worked. No one else had the same ruthlessness or the same cold precision that Jack brought to the table. "Fine," Vance said, standing up straight. "But remember, we're not the only ones who'll be hunting." "Then let them come," Jack replied, his voice colder than it had been in years. "I've been waiting for them." The tension in the cabin grew thicker as the two men stared each other down, a silent understanding passing between them. They had no time to waste. The clock was ticking, and whatever came next, it wouldn't be easy. Jack knew the stakes were high, but he also knew this was the only life he had left. The only one he was prepared to live. Vance turned toward the door, signaling that the conversation was over. Jack stood, pushing the chair back with a force that sent it skidding across the floor. He didn't need to say another word. He had already made his decision. "I'll be ready in 15, Jack said, heading toward the small bedroom in the back of the cabin. Vance didn't reply, but his gaze lingered on Jack for a moment longer than necessary. There was something in Jack's eyes, a cold fire, a hunger for vengeance, that made Vance wonder if they were making a mistake by putting all their faith in him. But then again, Vance knew that Jack had never been the kind of man who failed. He had always been a survivor. As Jack prepared, his mind was already racing ahead, planning his next move. This was the beginning of something bigger than he could have imagined. Whoever was pulling the strings, whoever had dared to leak his name, was about to find out what happens when they wake the lion. He was done hiding. Some secrets are buried so deep, they become part of the soil we walk on. Jack Morgan wasn't just a janitor. He was a living ghost from missions no one dares speak of, and when the truth came knocking, it didn't ask for permission. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because the most powerful stories are the ones we almost ignored.